You're not dreaming. You really are in Victorian Britain. And unfortunately, it's your day off, which sounds lovely, until you realize that fun here might mean standing shoulder to shoulder in a smoky music hall, hauling yourself to a football pitch, or unpacking a picnic in the cemetery, right between two fresh graves. Yes, welcome to leisure 19th century style. Close your eyes, sink back into a world of stiff collars, factory bells, and barely any free time. For most people, leisure was rare, rationed, and sometimes a little disturbing. But when the chance finally came, they grabbed it with both hands. From the respectable to the scandalous, from quiet cocoa rooms to rowdy pubs, from vignettes in parlors to séances in darkened halls, you'll see just how inventive people became when work let them go for just a moment. If you're listening right now, with both eyes open in bed, do me one favor. Subscribe. It costs you nothing, and at least one poor Victorian will rest easier knowing you did. And tell me in the comments what time and place you're watching from. I'm always curious to know. Now, settle under the covers, breathe a little slower, and let's drift into the peculiar, sometimes unsettling, sometimes cozy world of Victorian fun. Picture yourself waking up in a narrow bed. The sheets are coarse, the room cold, and outside your window, the factory bell is already tolling. It isn't even dawn, but the sound is your alarm clock. No snooze button, no 5 more minutes. If you're a Victorian servant, maid of all work, or mill hand, you're expected to be vertical and functioning before most people today have even tapped brew on the coffee machine. 12 to 16 hours of labor stretched ahead of you, and that was considered normal. 12 hours was respectable. 14 was common. And for the unlucky, 16 hours meant bending over spinning machines, hauling coal, or scrubbing flagstones until your hands bled. For most Victorians, this wasn't the kind of hard work builds character motivational nonsense people like to post online. This was simply survival. Take Hannah Culwick, a maid of all work in the 1860s. In her diary, she notes rising at 6, sometimes earlier, and finally staggering to bed after 11 at night. 17 hours on your feet, day after day, with only minutes to gulp water or catch your breath. And maid of all work was not an exaggeration. You washed floors, scrubbed dishes, lit fires, emptied chamber pots, polished shoes, fetched water, and ran errands. If a household chore existed, it was your responsibility. Leisure meant stealing 5 minutes at a window, watching other people walk by. In her diary, Culwick mentions once managing a walk along the pier with a friend, an event so rare she wrote it down like a treasure. Another time she recalled meeting another servant on Christmas afternoon. That was her holiday. 1 half-hour conversation, squeezed between chores. So before we even begin talking about Victorian fun, you need to understand the baseline: exhaustion. To find joy, you had to carve it out of a day designed to wring you dry. Now imagine shifting from the kitchen to the factory floor, a weaving shed in Lancashire, its walls echoing with the deafening clatter of looms. Hundreds of machines pound at your ears until you can't even think straight. Children scamper between the iron frames, sweeping up lint before it chokes the gears. Your lungs fill with cotton dust. Your hands are raw from oil and thread. If you're lucky, there's a lunch break. If you're not, you eat on your feet while the machines roar. And when the day ends, there's no Netflix, no reclining in a chair with a drink, no weekend plans. Maybe a pint at the pub if you've saved a penny, but most stagger home to a cramped tenement and collapse on straw bedding, ready to do it all again tomorrow. This is the world Victorians were desperate to escape, even for a single hour. Leisure was not a right, it was a privilege. It wasn't guaranteed, it wasn't respected, and it certainly wasn't consistent. Ask for time off, and you could lose your position. Wealthy families, of course, lived in an entirely different universe, able to spend hours on horseback or lounging in drawing rooms, attending theater boxes and music evenings. But for the majority, those who cooked, cleaned, mined, spun, hammered, and hauled, leisure was stolen, rationed, or simply absent. That is why even something as small as reading a newspaper by lamplight or tending a patch of garden became precious. These weren't hobbies. They were tiny rebellions against a schedule designed to grind you into the dust. Still, change crept in. By the 1860s, male office workers, clerks and accountants saw their hours trimmed slightly. Their days ended earlier, their weekends opened just a crack. And when a miracle occurred, a free hour that wasn't owned by an employer, they filled it with play. Cricket clubs sprouted across the country, with empty fields hastily converted into pitches. Football, still chaotic and half-invented, followed close behind. At first, these sports weren't about watching. They were about doing. Middle-class men wanted to run, to test themselves, to simply exist outside the ledgers and dusty offices. Crowds and stadiums would come later. In the beginning, fun meant gathering friends and running onto whatever patch of grass you could find. For the working class, the true turning point arrived in the 1870s and 1880s. The 10-hour day began to spread. 10 hours, 5 days a week, plus a half day on Saturday. Don't get carried away. 10 hours is still punishing. But compared to 16, it felt almost like freedom. And that Saturday half-day transformed the culture. For the first time, miners, builders, and factory hands found themselves free on Saturday afternoons. Entire industries of leisure rose to meet them. Football became their game. Local clubs formed, beer flowed, and trains carried fans across towns. The weekend crowd was born, and with it, the beginnings of mass leisure. Think about that contrast. Your week might be cluttered with emails after hours or annoying Zoom calls, and yes, it's exhausting. But imagine being 12 years old, bent over a loom for 14 hours straight. Imagine being a maid like Hannah Culwick, who thought a half-hour walk on Christmas Day was the highlight of her year. When you measure against that, you start to see why Victorians clung so fiercely to the tiniest scraps of enjoyment. Leisure wasn't relaxation, it was rebellion. It was proof you weren't just a machine part, grinding through someone else's profit. It was proof you were alive. So here you are, in a world where time isn't yours. The bell rings, the machines thunder, the master calls. You are owned from dawn to dusk. And yet out of that monotony, a Saturday afternoon begins to shine. You can almost feel the relief. That first step outside the factory doors. The air colder but cleaner, the thought forming. This afternoon is mine. It might only be a few hours, but compared to endless drudgery, it feels like freedom. That is the foundation of everything else we'll explore tonight. Every strange, morbid, inventive pastime Victorians created grew out of this simple truth, that for most of them, free time was a miracle. And what they did with that miracle tells us everything about how desperately humans crave fun, even when the world tries its hardest to deny it. Step out of the factory, or the counting house, or the servants' hall, and suddenly there's a curious sound filling the fields of Victorian England. It's not the grind of machinery or the slam of carriage wheels. It's the thwack of willow on leather, the shouts of men in waistcoats, trousers muddied at the knees, balls sailing across the air. This is cricket. And for the first time in the 1860s, ordinary clerks and office men had just enough time off to try their hand at it. It didn't begin as the polished, rule-bound sport you know today. Cricket in its early leisure form was scrappy, chaotic, and improvised. A spare patch of grass, a few bats, and men who were grateful for the chance to run after something other than a deadline. They weren't professionals. They were shop assistants, clerks, junior accountants, men who had only just begun to taste the novelty of shorter hours and a real Saturday afternoon. Cricket clubs sprang up everywhere, often sharing the same bit of land. Sometimes 3 or 4 clubs argued over the same pitch, each insisting it was their turn to play. The game was less about perfect form and more about being there. For men who had spent the week stooped over ledgers, playing cricket was less about sport and more about proving you still had a body attached to your brain. But something curious happened. As railways grew, trains began connecting towns and villages in ways unthinkable a generation earlier. Suddenly, you could travel to another town to play a match, or better yet, to watch one. And this small shift transformed cricket from a pastime into a spectacle. Instead of a handful of men stumbling about on a muddy patch of grass, you now had crowds gathering, swelling, traveling miles to see a particular team. You had players whose names began to matter, men spoken of with admiration, as if they were warriors. Cricket was no longer just a thing you did. It became a thing you went to see. Now, imagine yourself there. You're crammed on a train carriage, jostling with strangers, the air thick with coal smoke and anticipation. Everyone is buzzing about the match, who's playing, who's likely to win, which batsman is rumored to have a shot that could send the ball clear out of the ground. And when the players finally step onto the field, there's a roar. Not the quiet applause of polite society, but the shout of men who have waited all week for this release. For those in the crowd, it was a few precious hours of identity. No longer just factory hand or office clerk, but part of something bigger, louder, shared. And yet, if you happened to be on the field, fun took on a different meaning. Cricket was exhausting. Hours of play under the sun, running on uneven ground, fielding balls with bare hands. Remember, gloves weren't common then. You'd go home with bruised fingers and aching muscles. But exhaustion was almost welcome. Better to collapse into bed with sore limbs from sport than from labor. By the 1880s, however, a new contender began to rise. Football. And it was messy. Imagine a game where the rules weren't fixed, where one town might allow hacking, kicking your opponent's shins, while another town banned it. Where nobody was entirely sure how many men belonged on a team or how large the field should be. But it didn't matter. Football wasn't born neat and tidy. It was born loud, rough, and democratic. Cricket had already been claimed by clerks and middle-class men. Football belonged to the working class. Saturday afternoons became sacred to this new sport. When the half-day was introduced, men who had sweated in mines and mills all week poured onto fields with whatever ball they could find. They didn't need manicured pitches or proper uniforms, just boots, energy, and a little open ground. Teams formed, often linked to factories, churches, or neighborhoods, and just as with cricket, spectators soon followed. Trains carried crowds from one town to the next, turning what had been a scrappy pastime into a roaring public ritual. Picture yourself among them. The whistle blows, The ball flies, and suddenly it feels as though the entire town is surging forward. The pitch is muddy, the players are bruised, but the roar of the crowd drowns out everything. For a few hours, you're not just someone trapped in the grind of industrial Britain. You're a fan, a part of something alive, something that matters. Football gave ordinary men a community, a sense of belonging that no factory bell could erase. And with the rise of these sports came the birth of something even bigger: the Saturday crowd. For the first time in history, large groups of working people had coordinated leisure. Not just stolen minutes, not random afternoons, but the same collective window of time. And when you give a crowd freedom, they'll find ways to use it. Cricket for some, football for others, pubs afterward for most. The weekend itself was being born, and with it, a culture of organized fun. But here's the twist. While spectators roared and celebrated, players themselves often left the field battered. Football in particular was violent, chaotic, more survival than sport. Yet that brutality was part of the appeal. It mirrored the toughness of daily life, transformed into a game where pain wasn't punishment, but proof you'd fought. And for men who had no other outlet, that mattered. So imagine the scene. A Victorian Saturday, smoke drifting from factories still working for part of the day, but crowds already gathering, voices rising, trains rattling off to nearby towns. On a field, players scramble, mud flying, the crowd roaring in approval or outrage. At the edge of the pitch, vendors hawk drinks, children climb fences for a better view. This was fun, messy, loud, exhausting fun. Fun that gave meaning to the first real slices of free time ordinary people had ever been granted. And in those roars, in those bruised shins and sore throats, you can hear the birth of something that still defines weekends today. The Victorian Saturday crowd was the ancestor of every packed stadium, every loud chant, every shared thrill of sport. It wasn't just about cricket or football. It was about what happened when work finally loosened its grip and people discovered together that fun could be collective, public, and unforgettable. And while you're lying there, warm and comfortable, remember this. Some Victorian worker fought through 6 days of labor just to stand in the mud for 90 minutes and call it leisure. The least you can do from your bed is subscribe, so their struggle isn't completely forgotten. Step off the muddy football pitch or the cricket field, brush the soot from your trousers, and ask yourself one simple question: where to next? In Victorian Britain, the answer was usually obvious. You didn't go home to scroll your phone. You didn't put on slippers and binge a show. You went to the pub. And there were plenty to choose from. By some estimates, in towns and cities, there was one pub for every 30 households. Imagine that. On your street, every third door might open into a drinking room. They weren't grand taverns or sprawling beer halls. More often, they were just someone's front parlor, hastily converted into a place where ale was poured, pipes were smoked, and stories were swapped. Which pub you chose said a lot about you. It wasn't just geography. It was community. You went where your mates went, where you'd see the same faces at the same table, pint after pint, week after week. Now picture stepping inside. The air is thick with tobacco smoke. The fire is going. Boots scrape against the floorboards. You collapse onto a bench, pint in hand, and for the first time all week, you don't feel like just another cog in the industrial machine. You feel human. This was the real draw of the Victorian pub. Not the alcohol itself, but the warmth, the familiarity. the sense that someone would notice if you didn't turn up. It was a place to laugh at the boss behind his back, to swap gossip, to complain, to sing, to belong. Of course, belonging came with a price. 1 pint rarely stayed 1 pint. The pub had a way of multiplying time. You might swear you'd only stay half an hour, but suddenly the candles are low, the fire is dying, and you've drunk enough to stumble home sideways. For many men, the pub was a second home. For many wives, it was a second enemy. Alcoholism became such a visible problem in Victorian cities that entire reform movements rose to fight it. Factory wages too often went straight from the employer's hand to the landlord's purse, with a heavy stop at the publican's till in between. Newspapers carried stories of men spending their week's pay on drink while their families went hungry. Preachers thundered from pulpits about drunkenness as the root of poverty, sin, and social decay. The pub, for all its camaraderie, came to symbolize both comfort and crisis, and so the counterattack began. If the pub was a problem, reformers argued, then society needed an alternative, somewhere warm, safe, and sociable, but without the temptation of strong drink. Enter the cocoa room. It sounds comical now, an entire movement built on the promise of hot cocoa, but to Victorians, this was serious business. Beginning in the mid-19th century, cocoa rooms spread through towns and cities, offering cheap cups of chocolate, tea, or coffee. The idea was simple: lure men away from beer by giving them a different gathering place. Instead of staggering out drunk, you'd leave with a stomach full of cocoa and a head full of moral improvement. And unlike pubs, cocoa rooms often welcomed women. That alone was revolutionary. For a young woman, the pub was no-go territory, unless she wanted to risk her reputation. But a cocoa room, respectable, sober, and even wholesome. Couples could meet there. Families could stop in together. Suddenly, leisure wasn't only male. It's difficult to exaggerate how important that was. When women were allowed into public leisure spaces, it began to shift the balance of who could enjoy free time and how. The movement also had another weapon: reading rooms. Many cocoa rooms were attached to libraries or stocked with newspapers and magazines. Imagine sitting by the fire, cup of chocolate in hand, leafing through the latest issue of the Illustrated London News instead of drowning your wages in gin. Reformers believed this was the recipe for a healthier, more enlightened working class. Whether that's true or not, the fact remains. Cocoa rooms were serious competition for pubs. For a time, some towns had as many cocoa rooms as alehouses. You can still find faint traces today. Faded signage carved into stone lintels, a ghostly reminder of a time when cocoa was supposed to save the nation. But here's the catch. A cocoa room, no matter how comfortable, could never quite match the rowdy atmosphere of a pub. Yes, it offered warmth and fellowship, but no one ever sang bawdy songs over a mug of cocoa. No one staggered home boasting of the time they read a thrilling article about crop yields in the Times. Reformers wanted to uplift, but many workers simply wanted to unwind. For some, that meant cocoa. For most, it still meant beer. And yet, the cocoa room was far from a failure. It carved out spaces where women and men could gather together in public without scandal. It created a quieter, more respectable style of leisure. And in its own way, it planted the seed for future cafes and coffee houses, the sort of place you might be sitting in today, earbuds in, listening to this very story. So imagine it now. You've just finished your half-day Saturday. The factory whistle blows, the crowd disperses, and you're free for a few hours. Do you duck into the pub, where your mates are waiting with tankards in hand? Or do you try the cocoa room across the way, where the air is cleaner, the conversation calmer, and the company perhaps more respectable. It was a choice that defined not just how you spent your evening, but what kind of Victorian you wanted to be. And that choice, between the rowdy pull of the pub and the moral promise of cocoa, says a great deal about the era itself. The Victorians were always torn between indulgence and restraint, between pleasure and self-discipline, between tradition and reform. Even in something as simple as choosing where to sit on a Saturday night, you can hear the echoes of a society struggling to define itself. Now imagine it's evening. The sun has dipped below the chimneys. The factory whistles have gone silent, and the lamps along the street sputter into life. You've had your pint at the pub, or your cocoa if you're on the temperance track, and you're not ready to crawl home just yet. What you need is something louder, brighter, and decidedly less respectable. What you need is the music hall. Step inside and forget everything you've heard about polite Victorian restraint. The theater was for the middle and upper classes, a place of velvet seats, formal gowns, and Shakespeare performed in hushed tones. The music hall, by contrast, was rowdy, smoky, sweaty, and gloriously chaotic. Here, you didn't whisper, you shouted. You didn't sit still. You stamped your boots, clapped your hands, and banged your mug on the table if the act was good, or especially if it wasn't. Picture the scene. The hall is packed shoulder to shoulder, the air so thick with pipe smoke you could practically chew it. Men jostle for seats. Women in bright dresses lean forward on elbows. Children cling to their parents for a better view. The smell is a potent mix of tobacco, spilled beer, and cheap perfume. And then the gas lamps flare, the curtain twitches, and out steps the evening's first performer. The bill could contain almost anything. A singer with a ballad that makes the crowd sway. A comedian with jokes sharp enough to cut through the smoke. A magician producing doves from nowhere, or occasionally producing nothing at all, to the delight of hecklers. Animal acts trotted across the stage. Trained dogs leaping through hoops, parrots squawking insults at the audience, even the occasional donkey dragged into the spotlight for cheap laughs. No act was too small, no gimmick too silly, if it got the crowd roaring. And roar they did. A music hall crowd was not polite. They talked back. They shouted suggestions, they demanded encores, and they threw anything at hand if the act was bad enough. Tomatoes, rotten fruit, even boots were known to fly toward the stage. For the performer, survival meant not just talent, but toughness. You had to win the audience every single night, yet amid the chaos, stars were born. Take Marie Lloyd, the queen of the music hall. She strutted onto the stage in the 1880s with cheeky songs full of innuendo, the kind that made audiences howl with laughter while scandalizing the respectable classes. She sang of everyday life, of flirty encounters, of working-class mischief. One of her songs, "A Little of What You Fancy Does You Good," became a kind of unofficial motto of the halls. Respectable critics wrung their hands at her double meanings. Ordinary audiences adored her. She wasn't pretending to be lofty. She was theirs, speaking their language. Or consider Dan Leno, a comedian who could turn the smallest detail of daily life into a ridiculous pantomime. He made an art form of mockery, whether it was imitating the shuffle of an old man or the nagging tone of a mother-in-law. He became one of the first true celebrities of British comedy, beloved for his wit and absurdity. You can almost picture yourself there, laughing with aching ribs as Leno spun some domestic disaster into pure theater. Music halls weren't only entertainment, They were social mirrors. They reflected the hopes, frustrations, and humor of people crammed into factories and tenements all week long. If a politician was hated, there'd be a song about it. If a new fashion looked silly, there'd be a skit mocking it. In an era before radio or cinema, the music hall was where culture was made and remade nightly in smoke-filled rooms where every class mixed, if only for an evening. And make no mistake, it was scandalous. Women on stage were often accused of corrupting morals with suggestive songs. Men in the audience drank heavily, sang bawdy choruses, and left in a state their wives didn't always appreciate. Theaters had rules and boundaries. Music halls had momentum. They weren't just tolerated, they were loved, even as the middle-class moralists wagged their fingers. But here's the trick. The line between theater and music hall blurred over time. The more popular the halls became, the more they attracted audiences from across the social spectrum. A clerk who might have taken his wife to a respectable theater one weekend might sneak off to a music hall the next. Even aristocrats were known to slum it in the galleries, enjoying the raw energy you couldn't find in a polished production of Hamlet. Imagine yourself there. The table is sticky with spilled ale, your hands are sore from clapping, your throat is hoarse from shouting along with a chorus you barely know. The comedian bows, the crowd erupts, the band strikes up another tune, and for a few hours you forget entirely about the mill, the shop, the endless repetition of work. The music hall isn't just a distraction, it's an escape hatch. What makes it fascinating is how democratic it was. Theater demanded money, dress codes, and manners. Music halls welcomed you in whatever state you arrived. Dirty boots, rough clothes, laughter too loud for polite company. It was a place where the working poor could rub shoulders with clerks, where women could perform, and occasionally, even take control of their own celebrity. For all its smoke and scandal, the music hall was one of the few truly shared spaces of Victorian leisure. Of course, not everyone was happy about it. Critics claimed the music hall was ruining morals, encouraging drunkenness, and distracting workers from productive pursuits. Newspapers sneered, clergymen preached, and reformers begged for stricter licensing. But every night, the halls filled anyway, because after 14-hour shifts and endless weeks, people didn't want discipline. They wanted fun. And fun is exactly what the music hall delivered. A fun that was messy, unpredictable, sometimes shabby, but always alive. A fun that gave Victorians a sense of community far louder than the hush of a theater box. When you hear the faint echoes of laughter in an old Victorian building, when you see the posters advertising forgotten acts, you're catching the remnants of nights where life was briefly about joy instead of survival. So, as you drift deeper into this story, imagine the lamps dimming, the curtains rising, and the crowd around you bursting into song. It isn't polished, it isn't proper, but it's electric. This was the music hall, Victorian Britain's wild, smoky answer to the question, what did people do for fun? You've survived the smoke of the music hall. Your ears are still ringing from the rowdy choruses. Your clothes carry the scent of ale and tobacco. And you might be wondering, was there anywhere in Victorian Britain where leisure was just a little more refined? Somewhere you could sit down, straighten your jacket, and pretend, if only for an evening, that life was about culture rather than chaos. Enter the theater. Theater was the older cousin of the music hall, more respectable, more structured, and, at least in theory, more intellectual. Touring troupes carried Shakespeare and melodrama up and down the country, performing in towns that had never before seen a professional stage. Imagine being a miner's son, sitting in the gallery of a provincial theater, watching Hamlet for the very first time. You may not catch every word, but the spectacle, the costumes, the sword fights, the sheer drama of it all was enough to dazzle. For audiences ground down by daily life, theater gave them something vast, emotional, and larger than themselves. But theater wasn't only Shakespeare. In fact, by the mid-19th century, it was dominated by melodrama, sweeping tales of good and evil, villains in black cloaks, heroines in distress, heroes arriving just in time. Subtle? No. But effective? Absolutely. Victorians adored a story where the bad guy twirled his mustache and the good guy saved the day. The more tears, the better. You didn't go to theater for realism. You went to feel something. And after a week in the factory, exaggerated emotions felt almost like medicine. Yet the Victorians also had a taste for the unusual, the half-scientific, half-sensational. Enter the hypnotists. Imagine yourself sitting in a crowded hall as a man on stage swings a pocket watch, his voice slow, soothing, insistent. He picks a volunteer, perhaps someone who came in skeptical. And within minutes, the volunteer is stiff as a board or clucking like a chicken, to the roar of the audience. Was it science? Was it trickery? Nobody was entirely sure, but it was entertaining. Hypnotists blurred the line between education and spectacle. They claimed to be proving the mysteries of the human mind, demonstrating powers of suggestion and control. In practice, they were showmen, and the Victorians couldn't get enough. If you were lucky, you left convinced you'd glimpsed the future of science. If you were unlucky, you left wondering why you'd just spent money watching a grown man snore on stage. Either way, you talked about it afterward, and that was half the point. The same could be said for ventriloquists. Today, ventriloquism might seem a bit of a tired gimmick, but in the Victorian era, it was astonishing. Imagine seeing, for the first time, a wooden figure speak, argue, and sing in a voice that clearly wasn't the performer's. Was it magic? Was the doll alive? Crowds were mystified. The act combined humor, trickery, and the faintest edge of the uncanny. In a society fascinated by the border between science and illusion, ventriloquists hit the sweet spot. But perhaps the most revealing form of Victorian leisure was the lecture. Yes, the lecture. To us, it might sound like work disguised as entertainment. To the Victorians, it was both. Public lectures on every conceivable topic filled halls across the country: astronomy, geology, health, travel, morality, even phrenology. The study of bumps on the skull as a guide to personality. Imagine paying for a ticket, filing into a lecture hall, and sitting attentively while a man with mutton chop whiskers explained, with absolute confidence, that the shape of your forehead revealed your honesty. The fact that much of it was nonsense hardly mattered. People wanted to learn, or at least they wanted to feel like they were learning while being entertained. This obsession with lectures wasn't accidental. The Victorians lived in an age of rapid discovery. Steam power, electricity, railways, telegraphs. Every week seemed to bring something new, strange, and world-changing. Attending a lecture wasn't just leisure. It was participation in the excitement of progress. You might leave the theater having laughed at a comedy or wept at a melodrama. You left a lecture believing you'd caught a glimpse of the future. And make no mistake, these lectures were social events. People dressed respectably. They came in groups. They discussed what they'd heard afterward in drawing rooms and pubs. For many, lectures were an excuse to leave the house, mingle, and display their own curiosity. If the music hall was about release and the theater was about drama, the lecture was about aspiration, the desire to rise, to know, to be part of something bigger. So here you are, seated in a hall with hundreds of others. The lamps flicker, the speaker clears his throat, and the audience hushes. Perhaps he will reveal the wonders of electricity, demonstrating sparks leaping between wires. Perhaps he will recount exotic travels to the far reaches of the empire, describing jungles and deserts most of you will never see. Or perhaps he will insist that by measuring your skull, he can predict your moral character. You don't know what you're getting, but that's part of the fun. It's tempting to laugh at this now, but in a way, the Victorians were ahead of us. They turned performance into culture, and culture into performance. Theater, hypnotism, ventriloquism, and lectures all fed into the same hunger. The hunger to see and be seen, to learn and be entertained, to feel something beyond the grind of work. They wanted stories, illusions, explanations, spectacles, and they were willing to pay for them, sit through them, and talk about them afterward. And if you squint, you might recognize the pattern. What is a lecture, if not a live podcast, with slightly worse hairstyles? What is a melodrama, if not a blockbuster film, complete with over-the-top villains and improbable rescues? What is a hypnotist show, if not a precursor to reality TV, where people embarrass themselves in front of strangers? The Victorians didn't just invent ways to pass time. They invented the forms of entertainment we still rely on today. So, as you sink back into your pillow, imagine yourself in that hall. The performer is on stage, the crowd is leaning forward, the air hums with expectation. You're not just an audience member, you're part of a culture that believed leisure could also be spectacle, that even seriousness could be a show. And for a few hours, in the glow of lamplight, you're allowed to forget the factory, the soot, and the endless ticking of the clock. You're allowed to sit, to watch, and to believe, if only for a moment, that performance might just make life bearable. It's late afternoon in Victorian Britain, and the usual routines are starting to crack. The factory whistle has blown, the pub is filling, but tonight there's a different kind of energy in the air. You hear the music first, a wheezy brass band somewhere in the distance, a drum beat that grows louder as you follow it through the streets. Then you see it, a line of wagons rolling in, painted with bright colors, horses decked out in tassels, banners fluttering. The circus has come to town. For a people who lived most of their lives staring at soot, smoke, and endless brick walls, the arrival of a circus was nothing short of magic. Imagine standing in a muddy square as acrobats tumble from one wagon roof to another, as clowns toss sweets to children darting through the crowd. Posters plastered on walls promise daring feats, exotic animals, fire eaters, jugglers, and tightrope walkers. For the first time all week, you forget the factory, the ledger, the laundry pile. All eyes are on the spectacle. And when the big tent went up, it felt like stepping into another world. Inside, the air was thick with sawdust and anticipation. The crowd, families, workers, even the occasional middle-class onlooker, packed the benches, whispering, waiting. Then the drum rolled, the curtain lifted, and the parade began. Horses pranced, acrobats cartwheeled, performers dressed as Turks, Egyptians, or other exotics strutted their way into the ring. A ringmaster in top hat and coat cracked a whip and shouted orders. Suddenly, you weren't in Wolverhampton or Leeds anymore. You were in a kingdom of marvels. What made the circus so thrilling was its promise of danger. You could see acrobats soaring through the air, suspended by little more than rope and nerve. You could hear the audience gasp as a tightrope walker swayed, deliberately wobbling to send a shiver through the crowd. And you could smell the fear, or was it awe, when a lion or tiger was paraded into the ring. Of course, the poor animals weren't treated well, but Victorians weren't thinking about that. To them, this was a glimpse of the extraordinary, the wild, the impossible. And then, there were the fire eaters. Picture the scene. The lights dim, the audience hushes, and a man steps forward with a torch. He raises it to his mouth and swallows the flame. Children squeal, women clutch their companions' arms. Men lean forward open-mouthed. The performer exhales, and a burst of fire flares into the air. Was it science? Trickery? Demonic power? Nobody cared. It was spectacle, pure and simple. But the circus wasn't the only traveling thrill. Fairs dotted the Victorian calendar, from spring to harvest, each one a noisy, colorful explosion of sound and smell. Imagine the marketplace square transformed overnight, stalls draped with bunting, booths crammed with games, wheels of fortune spinning, vendors calling out their wares. You could try your luck at knocking down coconuts, win a prize at a shooting gallery, or eat something fried, sticky, and questionably edible. For children, it was paradise. For adults, it was a chance to forget themselves, if only for an afternoon. And fairs always came with sideshows. Some were harmless fun, jugglers balancing knives, strong men bending iron bars, fortune tellers peering into palms. Others were more unsettling, freak shows, where human difference was paraded as entertainment. A bearded lady, a man billed as the human skeleton, children with unusual conditions, all displayed for paying audiences. It's uncomfortable now, and rightly so, but in the Victorian era, this was part of the thrill. It was curiosity mixed with unease, amusement tinged with discomfort. People came not just to laugh or marvel, but to confront what felt strange, even taboo. Still, for all their oddities, fairs were beloved. They marked time in a world where weeks blurred into each other. The St. Giles's Fair in Oxford, the Goose Fair in Nottingham, the Hull Fair. These weren't just diversions. They were landmarks in the year. People saved coins for them, planned around them, told stories afterward about what they saw and whom they met. And at their heart was always the same thing: the joy of spectacle, of seeing something new and impossible, even if it was just a painted illusion. Think of how different this felt compared to daily life. Most Victorians lived in gray repetition: work, home, bed, repeat. Fun had to be cheap, quick, and shared. The circus and the fair offered something entirely outside that pattern. They were unpredictable. You never quite knew what you'd see: a trick gone wrong, an animal escaping, a performer soaring higher than seemed possible. That unpredictability was intoxicating. For a few hours, the ordinary rules didn't apply. And here's the strange part. These spectacles weren't just entertainment. They were social equalizers. In the dim light of a circus tent, the man in patched trousers sat shoulder to shoulder with the man in a pressed coat. At the fairground, everyone stood in the same mud, tried the same games, and ate the same sticky treats. For a society obsessed with class and respectability, the circus and fair offered rare moments when the divisions blurred, when the thrill of danger or wonder made everyone gasp together. Of course, not everyone approved. Moralists frowned at the noise, the drinking, the suggestive jokes from circus clowns. Reformers complained that fairs encouraged gambling, drunkenness, and disorder. Newspapers sneered that such spectacles distracted the working class from self-improvement. But no amount of finger-wagging stopped the tents from filling, or the fairgrounds from thrumming with life. Because the truth was simple. Victorians needed this. They needed the noise, the laughter, the thrill, to remind themselves that life could still surprise them. Now place yourself there. You're standing at the edge of a fairground, lanterns glowing, the air thick with the smell of fried cakes and horse dung, the cries of hawkers mixing with the squeals of children. You've just watched a strong man lift a barrel over his head, and now you're drawn to a booth promising the world's smallest pony. Behind you, music drifts from a carousel, its painted horses frozen mid-gallop. Ahead, the circus tent looms, promising one more wonder before the night ends. For this brief moment, you're not a servant, not a factory hand, not a clerk. You're just part of the crowd, mouth open in wonder, swept along by the spectacle. That's the power of the circus and the fair. They didn't erase the grind of Victorian life, but they broke through it. They reminded people that the world could still dazzle, even in the age of coal dust and deadlines. They gave children memories, adults laughter, and everyone, for a few fleeting hours, the chance to feel like life was more than work. And as you sink back into your pillow, think of those gasping crowds, those glowing tents, those bursts of impossible fire. For a people who lived most of their lives in shadows, this was light. Not gentle, not respectable, not always safe, but dazzling, defiant light. Blazing against the dark, Victorians spent their only free pennies chasing moments of light in the dark. You don't have to. Subscribing costs you nothing, and it keeps their fleeting joys from being forgotten. After the noise of the circus, the smoke of the music hall, and the roar of the football crowd, you might be craving something quieter. Victorians did too. Not every form of fun was rowdy, scandalous, or half-drunken. Some of it was surprisingly simple: soil, seeds, and a patch of green. Imagine you're stepping out of a cramped row house in an industrial city. Behind you lies the constant rattle of carts, the endless coughing of chimney stacks, and the smell of smoke that seeps into every coat and curtain. But just beyond the back door, if you're lucky, there's a tiny square of ground. Perhaps it's no bigger than a blanket spread out on the grass. Perhaps it's shared with neighbors. Still, it's yours, or at least yours to coax into life. You plant beans, onions, maybe potatoes, and when the shoots rise from the dirt, it feels like a small miracle. For a working family, this wasn't just about food, it was fun. It was escape. The Victorians called them allotments, small plots of rented land, usually on the edge of town, where laborers could grow vegetables to feed their families. They began as acts of charity, then spread as a movement. Councils, churches, and wealthy landowners offered parcels to the poor, believing that gardening would keep men sober, industrious, and out of the pub. And for once, the moralists weren't entirely wrong. A man who spent his Saturday digging potatoes was at least not spending his wages on gin. But the real story isn't moral reform. It's leisure. For men who worked in deafening factories, the allotment was quiet. For those who spent their days underground in mines, the allotment was light. For families crammed into two-room tenements, the allotment was space. There, among rows of beans and peas, they found something like freedom. You could work with your hands on your own terms, bend over soil instead of a machine, and watch life grow instead of watching it wear you down. And gardening wasn't only for men. In an age when women's leisure was tightly policed, tending flowers was one of the few respectable outdoor activities allowed. A middle-class lady might be warned against too much exertion, but no one objected if she pruned roses or arranged a bed of geraniums. Gardening was considered gentle, moral, and safely domestic, an extension of housework that just happened to occur outside. But in practice, it offered women a rare taste of independence. To shape a garden, to decide what would live and what would be cut, was to exercise a kind of authority denied elsewhere. In that sense, flower beds became small battlegrounds of freedom. For the middle class, gardening became a badge of refinement. Suburban homes sprouted front lawns and back gardens, carefully tended to display taste and prosperity. A neat hedge, a trimmed path, a show of roses. These were not luxuries but statements. They said, "I have time, I have space, I am respectable." Garden manuals multiplied, teaching readers how to arrange flower beds in pleasing patterns or cultivate exotics in glass houses. A walk through a middle-class suburb in the 1870s was like browsing a catalog of horticultural ambition. But whether in a suburban garden or a humble allotment, the deeper appeal was the same. Gardening was a way of escaping the industrial city. Even a few square yards of green felt like a world apart from smoke and soot. To plant a seed and watch it grow was to defy the choking air, to insist that beauty and life could exist alongside chimneys and grime. Every cabbage was a rebellion, every rose a quiet victory. Now imagine yourself in that moment. You're kneeling in the soil, dirt under your nails, back aching but strangely content. Around you, the air smells not of coal, but of earth. Birds pick at the edges of your plot. Children chase one another between rows. Your spouse leans on a hoe and sighs with satisfaction. It's not a circus. It's not a spectacle, but it's fun. Fun measured in blossoms and harvests, in the slow rhythm of nature rather than the shrill beat of a factory bell. And of course, Victorians couldn't help but turn even this into a social event. Gardening clubs formed, prizes were awarded, and annual shows became common. People competed over the straightest carrots, the largest pumpkins, the brightest flowers. Newspapers reported on these contests with the same seriousness they gave to parliamentary debates. Winning first place for marrows might not sound glamorous now, but in a small Victorian town, it was cause for celebration and bragging rights for months. It's worth noting how radical this was. Fun, for most of human history, was public, loud, and shared. Gardening shifted it to something quieter, slower, and more personal. It gave families the chance to bond in fresh air. It allowed individuals to take pride in something entirely their own. And it offered, perhaps more than any other pastime, the illusion of control in a world where so much was dictated by bosses, landlords, and social rank. For women in particular, gardens were often refugees. A lady could write letters in her rose garden, sip tea among her flower beds, or simply walk the paths without drawing criticism. Men had pubs and clubs, women had parterres and pergolas. Gardening let them breathe, and in a society where women's lives were bound in corsets, both literal and metaphorical, that was no small gift. So when you think of Victorian fun, don't imagine only the noisy crowds and scandalous halls. Think also of the quiet plots and hidden gardens. Think of men whistling softly as they dug potatoes, of women snipping roses in the fading light, of children chasing butterflies between bean poles. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't loud, but it was real. It was theirs. And for you, lying there listening, perhaps it's the easiest to imagine. The sound of a spade slicing into earth, the smell of fresh soil, the sight of green leaves against gray skies. No tickets, no entrance fees, no roaring crowd, just the simple miracle of coaxing life from dirt. For Victorians, this was escape. For a few stolen hours, they built miniature Edens in the shadow of industry. And in those gardens, for once, the world was quiet. Close your eyes and imagine the sound of water, not dripping pipes or rain leaking through your roof, but waves rolling against a beach. For a Victorian family trapped all week in the grime of the city, this sound was the very definition of luxury. The seaside was the dream, the promised land, the place where industrial soot gave way to salt air and factory bells were drowned out by gulls. Getting there wasn't always easy. Before the age of trains and steamers, a trip to the coast was a fantasy reserved for the wealthy. But by the mid-19th century, things changed. Railways stretched their steel fingers across Britain. Paddle steamers churned up rivers and estuaries, and suddenly even working-class families could manage a day down the water. Imagine yourself crammed into a steamer, the air full of coal smoke and excitement, children darting between legs while vendors sold gingerbread and lemonade. The boat rocked, the whistle blew, and for once, you weren't headed to work. You were headed for the sea. And what awaited was more than just a beach. Resorts bloomed along the coast. Blackpool, Scarborough, Brighton, Margate. Once sleepy fishing towns, they transformed into playgrounds of deck chairs and promenades. Piers stretched into the water, lined with shops, entertainers, and brass bands. Hotels rose to accommodate crowds. Whole economies were built around the sudden hunger for sea air and sunlight. For the Victorians, this wasn't just leisure, it was therapy. Doctors insisted that bathing in salt water cured ailments, that breathing sea air restored lungs blackened by soot. A dip in the sea was medicine, they claimed, and Victorians were eager patients. So you waded into the water, whether or not you could swim, believing it would wash away not just dirt, but disease. Of course, there was a problem. The Victorians were famously obsessed with modesty. The idea of men and women plunging half-naked into the water together was unthinkable. Enter the bathing machine, a small wooden hut on wheels, drawn by horses into the shallows. You stepped inside fully clothed, changed into your bathing costume, and then emerged directly into the sea, hidden from the eyes of onlookers. Some machines even had canvas tunnels to ensure complete discretion. Imagine struggling with all that just to splash about for 10 minutes. Fun, yes, but fun smothered in etiquette. And the costumes themselves, well, don't imagine bikinis. Men wore long woolen suits that clung miserably when wet. Women were swaddled in dresses with puffed sleeves and skirts weighted at the hem so they wouldn't float up. Swimming in them was practically impossible, but swimming wasn't the point. The point was to paddle about modestly, perhaps giggling behind a parasol, while convincing yourself that your health was improving by the minute. Still, the seaside offered freedoms you couldn't find elsewhere. Families picnicked on the sand, children built castles, couples strolled arm in arm along the promenade. Bands played, vendors sold ices, photographers snapped portraits against painted backdrops of palm trees and exotic landscapes. Even if the sea was freezing and the wind sharp, the mood was one of holiday. Here, at least for a few hours or days, you could breathe differently, live differently. Think of yourself there. You've just stepped off the steamer, legs unsteady, eyes dazzled by the expanse of water. The air smells sharp and clean, a shock after months of smoke, You sit on the sand, feel the grit between your fingers, hear children squealing as they chase waves. A donkey ride passes by, the animal plodding patiently while a child clings to the saddle. Behind you, the pier beckons with its promise of sweets, games, and music. You're tired, you're still poor, but for once, you are happy. Of course, seaside holidays had their own hierarchy. The wealthy booked hotels, enjoyed private bathing areas, and promenaded in their finest clothes. The working poor brought bread and jam, slept in cheap lodgings, and splashed wherever they were allowed. Yet the sea itself was democratic. Rich or poor, you faced the same cold water, the same stiff breeze, the same seagulls trying to steal your lunch. And the seaside, like so much Victorian fun, became commercial. Piers charged admission. Resorts advertised aggressively. Entrepreneurs built attractions, aquariums, theaters, arcades. What had begun as a medical craze, take the waters, turned into a booming leisure industry. By the 1880s, a trip to the seaside was almost a rite of passage, as much a part of the year as harvest or Christmas. The best part, perhaps, was the sense of collective joy. Trains pulled into seaside stations and poured out crowds by the hundreds. Streets filled with families carrying baskets, workers with rolled-up trousers, sweethearts arm in arm. Entire factories sometimes organized excursions, giving employees a rare taste of leisure en masse. For a people used to being ground down individually, that communal exodus to the beach was powerful. For once, everyone was off the clock together, united in the pursuit of nothing more profound than fresh air and sand between their toes. So, as you lie there listening, picture the scene. The shriek of gulls overhead, the crash of waves, the scent of salt and vinegar from a chip stall. You're on the sand, the wind tugging at your hat, the horizon stretching wide. It doesn't matter that the bathing costume itches, that the water is icy, that your picnic is plain. What matters is that you're here, not at work, not in smoke, but at the edge of the world, where the sea meets sky. And for the Victorians, that was enough. The seaside was fun, freedom, therapy, and memory rolled into one. It was a glimpse of a life beyond chimneys and machines. It was, in its own way, paradise, wool skirts, bathing machines, and all. By now, you've had your pint at the pub, your laugh at the music hall, maybe even your day at the seaside. But what if your idea of fun wasn't shouting yourself hoarse in a smoky hall, or dragging children through sand and donkey rides? What if you wanted your leisure dressed up as medicine, respectable, refined, and just a little smug? Then you went to a spa town. Spa towns were Victorian Britain's answer to the wellness retreat. Think Bath, Harrogate, Tunbridge Wells, places where the wealthy flocked to take the waters. That phrase didn't just mean swimming. It meant drinking mineral-rich spring water, bathing in pools, strolling up and down promenades, and pretending it was all terribly scientific. Imagine yourself holding a delicate glass, sipping water that tasted like rust, and nodding solemnly as if you were curing every ailment from gout to melancholy. In reality, most of it probably just made you burp. But that was part of the fun. You weren't just drinking water, you were participating in a ritual. The act of gathering in a pump room, watching others grimace as they swallowed, chatting between sips. It was as much about society as it was about health. To be seen at Bath or Harrogate meant you were someone who cared about your well-being, or at least someone with the money to look like you did. For the wealthy, spa towns were playgrounds. You lodged in fine hotels, dressed in your best clothes, and promenaded daily along manicured streets. The promenade itself was half the point. Everyone strolled in circles, inspecting one another, gossiping, displaying new fashions. Leisure here wasn't about hiding from the world. It was about performing in it. You walked, you were seen, you signaled your place. If the seaside gave you freedom, the spa gave you prestige. But you didn't have to be rich to crave the waters. Across the country, smaller towns offered their own springs and baths for the less wealthy. Families who couldn't afford Bath might make do with Buxton or some local mineral well. Even poorer visitors scraped pennies to drink from public pumps or bathe in communal baths. The science was shaky, but the appeal was obvious. If you could tell yourself that a cup of foul-tasting water might fix your cough or aching joints, why not try it? At least it gave you a story to tell, and spas weren't just about the water. They became hubs of entertainment. Concerts, dances, lectures, and theatrical performances filled the evenings. If you were in Bath in its prime, you weren't simply treating your health. You were attending balls, dining, mingling with aristocrats, and maybe even catching the eye of a potential spouse. Whole plots of Victorian novels unfold in spa towns because they were the perfect mix of leisure, romance, and spectacle. Jane Austen set not one but 2 novels in Bath. For her characters, taking the waters was as much about taking stock of the marriage market as it was about health. Now, imagine yourself there. You're strolling through a colonnaded pump room, glass in hand, chandeliers glittering overhead. You sip the mineral water and try not to make a face. Around you, ladies in silks and men in polished boots murmur over the latest gossip. A band plays softly in the background. Outside, carriages clatter past hotels with names designed to impress. The Royal Crescent, the Crown, the Grand. You're not here to get better. You're here to be part of something. And yet, in the middle of all this refinement, the line between medicine and recreation blurred constantly. Doctors preached the benefits of bathing, but everyone knew it was just as much about the dancing afterward. Reformers talked of health, but businessmen saw profit. Mineral water was bottled, sold, and shipped. Bathing houses charged entry. The wellness industry was alive and well long before Instagram. Of course, there was always a touch of comedy. Imagine respectable men and women, trussed up in modest bathing costumes, lowering themselves gingerly into tepid pools, all the while insisting it was good for the liver. Picture the grim determination with which people choked down sulfurous water, cheeks twitching, while pretending it was delicious. Whole guidebooks gave advice on how much to drink without fainting. Yet nobody stopped coming. In fact, the worse the taste, the more convinced people became that it must be working. For poorer families, spa visits looked different. Instead of fine hotels, you might share lodgings with strangers. Instead of glittering promenades, you'd wander muddy streets with paper cones of food. But even at the humbler spas, the sense of occasion was there. You weren't just surviving another weekend's smoke. You were away, even if only for a day, and that alone was medicine enough. The allure of spa towns lasted well into the late Victorian period. Their heyday eventually faded as railways made seaside resorts more popular and modern medicine chipped away at the myth of miracle waters. But for decades, they stood as one of the most fashionable ways to blend fun and respectability. You could tell yourself you were taking care of your health while spending entire afternoons gossiping on promenades. You could claim to be healing while sneaking in a dance, a flirtation, or a card game. So here you are, in a spa town, glass of mineral water in hand, strolling slowly under the colonnades. The band plays, the crowd murmurs, the chandeliers glint. You sip, wince, and tell yourself you feel better already. Maybe you do. Or maybe the real cure was never in the water at all, but in the laughter, the company, and the chance to step out of ordinary life. For Victorians, that was the real prescription. Not the minerals, not the sulfur, but the simple human pleasure of being together in a world that felt for once refined and hopeful. Let's be honest. When you think of a pleasant afternoon picnic, your mind probably goes to a meadow, a park, maybe a shady spot under a tree. What it doesn't go to is a graveyard. Yet in Victorian Britain, cemeteries were among the most fashionable destinations for leisure. Imagine unwrapping your sandwiches while sitting on a tomb, watching your children play tag between headstones, and chatting about the weather over the resting place of Aunt Mildred. Morbid? Perhaps. But for Victorians, it was both ordinary and oddly comforting. To understand this strange pastime, you have to remember what cemeteries were like before the Victorians redesigned them. In earlier centuries, burials often took place in cramped churchyards, small patches of land behind a parish church. By the 1800s, these spaces were overflowing, unsanitary, and frankly unpleasant. Graves were shallow, headstones crowded, and the smell in summer could be, well, let's just say nobody was lingering with a picnic basket. Death was ever present, but it wasn't landscaped. Then came the great reimagining of cemeteries. Inspired by European models like Père Lachaise in Paris, Britain began building sprawling garden cemeteries. Highgate in London, Kensal Green, and others opened in the 1830s and 1840s. These weren't grim churchyards. They were carefully planned landscapes, sweeping paths, ornate monuments, sculpted trees, and benches. They looked more like parks than burial grounds. Designed to impress the living as much as to house the dead, they became public attractions. And so, families came. A Saturday afternoon might find mothers spreading blankets among the gravestones, children skipping between angel statues, fathers strolling along gravel paths with newspapers in hand. Why not? Cemeteries were green, relatively quiet, and, unlike many private gardens, free. If you lived in a cramped city, where soot blackened every wall and fresh air was a rarity, the cemetery was your escape. There was also something distinctly Victorian about embracing leisure in the presence of death. Remember, this was a culture drenched in mourning. High mortality rates meant nearly every family lost children, parents, or siblings young. Mourning clothes were a fashion industry. Queen Victoria herself set the tone, wearing black for decades after Prince Albert's death. Death was not hidden. It was woven into everyday life. To sit among graves wasn't ghoulish. It was almost natural. It reminded people of family ties, of memory, of continuity. Eating lunch beside a headstone might even feel like a form of communion with the dead. And let's not forget the Victorians' appetite for spectacle. Cemeteries weren't just places of quiet reflection. They were tourist attractions. Guidebooks listed notable graves to visit, such as famous authors, politicians, or war heroes. People strolled through, pointing out monuments, admiring stonework, even sketching elaborate memorials. For artists, the cemetery was an outdoor gallery. For families, it was both entertainment and education, teaching children about history, morality, and mortality all at once. Now imagine yourself there. You're sitting on a blanket, passing out slices of bread and cheese, maybe a flask of tea. Around you rise marble obelisks, winged angels, and weeping willows carved in stone. Children laugh as they run along gravel paths, only pausing when warned not to trip over a grave. A vendor strolls by, selling gingerbread or lemonade. In the distance, a funeral procession winds slowly toward a vault, and for a moment, leisure and grief share the same space. This was Victorian life, the everyday folded around death like ivy around stone. Of course, not everyone approved. Critics muttered that picnics in cemeteries blurred the line between respect and irreverence. Priests scolded those who treated sacred ground like a tea garden. Authorities eventually began banning refreshments on graves, alarmed by reports of litter, noise, and rowdy behavior. There are accounts of families sprawling across plots as if they were in Hyde Park, bottles scattered, laughter ringing out over epitaphs. Reformers decided that was a step too far. Cemeteries might look like parks, but they weren't meant to become them. Still, the habit lingered. People continued to treat cemeteries as green space, strolling, sketching, and quietly resting even after picnics were frowned upon. And it's not hard to see why. In a century when public parks were scarce, cemeteries filled the gap. They gave working families somewhere to go, somewhere that felt clean, open, and even beautiful. There was also an element of fascination. Cemeteries told stories. A wander among the monuments revealed who died young, who died wealthy, who was remembered in poetry, and who with a simple cross. Names and epitaphs became conversation starters. Here lies so-and-so, beloved husband and father. There rests a young girl, taken at 15. The Victorians didn't just read these inscriptions, they built narratives around them. Every grave was a reminder of how fragile life was, and how meaningful leisure could be in the face of it. And let's be honest, the Victorians had fewer places to go. No shopping malls, no cinemas, no weekend theme parks. Entertainment had to be carved out of what was available. And sometimes that meant turning the company of the dead into an afternoon outing. Morbid? Perhaps. But also practical. The dead didn't mind the company, and the living needed somewhere to breathe. Think of it. You're sitting in that cemetery, your children nibbling buns, your spouse sighing in relief at being outside. The sky gray, but the air fresher than at home. Around you, angels and urns lean under ivy. Doves perch on headstones, and the hum of the city feels far away. It's peaceful in its own peculiar way. For the Victorians, this was not just fun, it was balance, a way of reconciling the ever-present reality of death with the stubborn need to live. Today, the idea of cemetery picnics seems eccentric, even disrespectful. But perhaps it made sense. When mortality is always at your door, you learn not to avoid it, but to fold it into your life. Eating among graves wasn't about laughing at death. It was about refusing to let death take away the little joys left to you. So the next time you hear about a Victorian picnic in a cemetery, don't picture ghouls feasting on tombs. Picture ordinary families, tired from work, desperate for open air, finding it in the only green places available. Picture children playing among monuments, not out of disrespect, but because they had nowhere else to play. And picture parents smiling faintly, knowing that even in the shadow of death, there could still be laughter. That was Victorian fun too. Morbid, yes, but also resilient. A reminder that life, even when shortened and shadowed, always reaches for light. By now you've seen the Victorians at their most respectable, promenading in spa towns, arranging roses in suburban gardens, sipping mineral water with straight faces. But let's not pretend they were always paragons of dignity. The same people who clutched pearls over women singing cheeky songs at the music hall also crowded into tents to gawk at human oddities. Welcome to the world of freak shows, where curiosity, cruelty, fascination, and profit all tangled together. Picture it. You're in a fairground or a crowded city hall, the smell of sawdust and sweat in the air, a painted banner outside promising wonders inside. Step closer and the posters shout at you. See the world's smallest man, witness the dog-faced boy, marvel at the bearded lady. For a few pennies, you enter, squeeze between bodies, and crane your neck to the stage. What you find there is part spectacle, part exploitation, and part mirror of Victorian society itself. The king of this world was P.T. Barnum, the American showman whose traveling exhibitions reached Britain and left their mark. Barnum perfected the art of hype, giant posters, dramatic claims, clever exaggerations. His most famous star was General Tom Thumb, real name Charles Stratton, a performer barely over 3 feet tall. Dressed in fine clothes, trained in witty banter, Tom Thumb became an international sensation. Crowds adored him. Queen Victoria herself invited him to court and laughed at his jokes. To audiences, Tom Thumb was more than a curiosity. He was a celebrity. Children wanted to see him. Adults admired him. Newspapers printed his every move. But behind the fame was a more complicated truth. He was both celebrated and commodified, a man whose body was turned into entertainment. He earned a fortune, but never escaped being treated as a spectacle. Victorians, who prided themselves on progress, were still eager to pay for a glimpse of someone different. And then there was Jojo the dog-faced boy, real name Fedor Jevtichu, a Russian performer with a genetic condition that covered his face in thick hair. Barnum presented him as half human, half animal, supposedly raised by wolves in Siberia. The story was nonsense, but audiences loved it. They gasped at his appearance, laughed at his performances, whispered about his wild origins. For Jojo, the freak show was both a prison and a stage. It gave him work, fame, even travel, but only by turning his difference into a cage. The Victorians were fascinated by these shows, not because they were monsters, but because they were people, human enough to speak, sing, or smile, different enough to seem extraordinary. In a society obsessed with order and classification, where phrenologists measured skulls and scientists cataloged every species, the freak show was irresistible. It promised a living puzzle, a human riddle to be solved. Now, imagine yourself in that tent. The crowd presses in, murmurs rise, and the curtain parts. A man steps forward, his body unusually tall, or short, or hairy, or twisted. The crowd gasps, leans forward, stares. You stare too. You know it's rude, but you can't help yourself. That's the paradox of the freak show. It invited you to judge, but it also invited you to wonder. Was this cruelty, or was this fascination? Was it entertainment, or was it exploitation dressed in velvet? For the performers, it was both. Many were coerced, trapped, or tricked into contracts that paid little and demanded much. Others embraced the stage, turning their uniqueness into a livelihood. Some, like Tom Thumb, achieved fame and wealth unimaginable for someone of his background. Others, like countless unnamed performers, disappeared into obscurity once their novelty faded. The freak show gave them visibility, but only on society's terms. And it wasn't just the poor who went. These exhibitions cut across classes. Working families saved pennies for tickets, while the middle classes justified their attendance as educational. doctors, and scientists often sat in the audience, scribbling notes, as if the show were a living lecture. Respectability blurred with voyeurism. A mother might shush her child for laughing too loudly, while secretly craning her own neck for a better view. Everyone knew it was questionable, but everyone went anyway. The moralists, of course, had their say. Critics denounced freak shows as degrading, exploitative, indecent. Reformers argued that these people deserved dignity, not display. Yet for every sermon preached, another tent filled. The Victorians were too curious to resist. They lived in an age of discovery, exploration, and cataloging, and the freak show fed the same appetite as natural history museums and zoological gardens. The difference was that these specimens spoke back, sang, and sometimes joked at the expense of the crowd. There was a thrill in that too. The freak show unsettled as much as it entertained. To see a human who didn't fit expected categories was to be reminded that normal was a fragile concept. Some audience members walked away reassured that they were ordinary. Others walked away shaken, realizing how arbitrary that line really was. Either way, the freak show left its mark. Think of yourself leaving one. You step back into the fairground, the noise of the crowd washing over you, your mind buzzing with images of the bearded lady or the dog-faced boy. You tell yourself it was just entertainment, but you can't quite shake the feeling that you've glimpsed something deeper. You've seen humanity in a distorted mirror, strange, unsettling, but undeniably human. That unease was part of the attraction, and that's why freak shows mattered in Victorian leisure. They weren't just about spectacle. They were about curiosity, about the thrill of difference, about confronting the boundaries of what people thought it meant to be human. They gave the Victorians both a laugh and a shiver, both a distraction and a lesson, however uncomfortable. So as you lie there listening, imagine yourself in that crowded tent. The curtain lifts, the spotlight falls, the crowd gasps. You're not just watching a show. You're watching the Victorians wrestle with their own fascination, their own prejudices, their own humanity. It was messy, it was exploitative, but it was also unforgettable. And that was enough to keep the crowds coming back, week after week, coin after coin, to stare at the wonders of the human world. Victorians had to pay coins to stare at human difference. You don't. All you have to do is subscribe, so their uneasy stories aren't left to vanish in the dark. You've had your fair share of fun by now. Picnics among tombstones, cheering at football matches, sipping foul-tasting spa water. But for some Victorians, none of that was thrilling enough. They wanted a different kind of entertainment. Not noisy, not muddy, not even healthy. They wanted answers. They wanted mystery. They wanted to talk to the dead. Welcome to the strange, candlelit world of Victorian spiritualism. Imagine yourself in a darkened parlor, heavy curtains drawn, gas lamps turned low. A group of well-dressed men and women sit around a polished table, hands lightly touching, eyes wide with anticipation. A medium clears her throat, calls upon the spirits, and then, tap, 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 phantom rappings echo from somewhere unseen. A woman gasps. A man mutters a prayer. And you? You're leaning forward, wondering whether you've just witnessed proof of life after death or a very good piece of theater. The craze began across the Atlantic in 1848 with the Fox Sisters of Hydesville, New York. They claimed they could communicate with spirits through coded knocks. Word spread like wildfire, and before long, spiritualism had crossed the ocean. By the 1850s, séances were all the rage in Britain. The Victorians, already obsessed with mourning and mortality, were eager audiences. If you had lost a child to disease, a parent to cholera, or a husband to war, the idea of speaking with them again, even just for a moment, was irresistible. And séances were nothing if not theatrical. Mediums claimed to summon spirits who rapped on tables, floated trumpets, or even manifested ghostly hands in the darkness. Some spoke in trances, voices changing as if another presence had slipped inside. Levitations thrilled audiences as tables lifted off the ground or objects flew across the room. Were they tricks? Almost certainly. But in the moment, by candlelight, with hearts pounding and grief close to the surface, they felt real enough. Even the highest circles were not immune. Queen Victoria herself dabbled in spiritualism after Prince Albert's death, desperate for comfort. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, spent years convinced of its truth, attending séances and writing passionately in defense of the spirits. It's almost ironic. The man who gave us the most logical detective in literature spent much of his later life believing in ghosts. But that was the allure. Spiritualism attracted skeptics and believers alike, mixing rational inquiry with emotional hunger. And that's the key to its popularity. Séances weren't just religion, and they weren't just entertainment. They sat in a peculiar in-between space, half science, half theater. Mediums invited scrutiny, claiming their powers could withstand the gaze of skeptics. Audiences came ready to test them, to observe, to judge. But they also came to be dazzled. The séance was as much about suspense as any stage play. Would the spirit appear? Would the table rise? Would someone faint dramatically in the corner? Now, put yourself in that room. The curtains are drawn, the air is close, the table creaks under your fingertips. A voice calls from nowhere, a trumpet blares, a shadow flits across the wall. You're not sure if it's a ghost or just the medium's accomplice hiding under the furniture, but your heart races anyway. For an hour, you're caught between belief and disbelief, between longing and laughter. And when the lights come up, you leave buzzing, half convinced, half skeptical, fully entertained. Of course, not everyone was fooled. Stage magicians like Harry Houdini made it their mission to expose fraudulent mediums, replicating their tricks in public to prove how easily audiences could be deceived. Scientists conducted controlled experiments, insisting the knocks and movements were nothing more than sleight of hand. Newspapers alternated between breathless reports of miracles and scathing exposés of fraud. Yet the séances never stopped. For every skeptic, there were 10 believers ready to defend what they had seen, or what they needed to see. Because in the end, spiritualism fed on grief. The Victorians lived in an age of high mortality. Disease, accidents, and epidemics cut lives short. Families were rarely untouched by loss. Mourning was not an occasional burden, it was a constant companion. Black crepe, memorial portraits, and locks of hair in lockets were everyday reminders. For people living with such relentless absence, the séance offered hope, a chance, however contrived, to imagine the dead still present, to hear a voice, to feel a touch, to believe that love wasn't severed by the grave. But let's not romanticize too much. Séances could be silly, and audiences often treated them that way. Parlor games flourished, table turning, where groups tried to make the furniture spin, spirit boards with letters and pointers spelling out messages, even amateur mediums pretending to summon lost pets or dead neighbors. Not every séance was solemn mourning. Sometimes it was just a party trick, a spooky thrill to pass the evening. Victorians enjoyed being scared almost as much as they enjoyed being reassured. And in that sense, spiritualism was entertainment disguised as revelation. It tapped into the same energy as the circus, the music hall, even the freak show, the desire to be astonished, to glimpse something beyond the ordinary. The only difference was that here, the astonishment carried the weight of eternity. So imagine leaving one of these gatherings. You step out into the foggy night, heart still pounding, head buzzing with questions. Did you really hear your mother's voice? Did the table truly rise? Or did someone's knee do the work? You don't know. You may never know. But the thrill lingers, and that was enough. That was Victorian spiritualism, equal parts faith and fraud, grief and glee. A ghostly game that made people feel both foolish and comforted, skeptical and spellbound. It blurred lines the Victorians loved to draw between science and superstition, mourning and merriment, the living and the dead. And perhaps that's why it spread so quickly, filling parlors, drawing rooms, and concert halls. It didn't matter whether you were a queen, a writer, or an exhausted factory worker. The pull of the unknown was the same. For a people surrounded by death, the promise of one more conversation was irresistible. So, as you lie there in the dark, picture yourself seated at that table. Your hand trembles slightly as the room falls silent. The knock comes, faint at first, then louder. Someone gasps. Someone whispers your name. Is it a trick? Almost certainly. But in that moment, you don't care. Because for a brief second, you've touched the edge of mystery. And that, for the Victorians, was its own kind of fun. So far, you've sat in smoky pubs, strolled along seaside piers, and even tried to speak with ghosts. But not all Victorian fun required crowds, tickets, or the risk of bumping into a drunk man singing off-key. Sometimes fun was homemade. Sometimes you didn't need a stage. You made one right in your own living room. Welcome to the world of tableaux vivants, living pictures, family theatrics, and what we might now call early cosplay. Picture this. You're in a respectable middle-class drawing room. Gas lamps flickering, curtains drawn. The furniture has been shoved to the side, and your aunt is draped in a sheet, pretending to be a Greek goddess. Your cousin is balancing a cardboard shield and looking unconvincing as a Roman soldier. The rest of the family sits in chairs, clapping politely, pretending that yes, this does look exactly like a famous painting. That was the tableau vivant, a staged recreation of artwork, literature, or myth performed by family and friends for the sheer joy of it. It might sound quaint, but these living pictures were popular across society. Families loved arranging themselves into frozen scenes, holding poses for minutes at a time, often with elaborate costumes cobbled together from whatever was in the wardrobe. Children became angels, parents became kings or martyrs, neighbors dropped by to be part of a biblical scene. The effect was part theater, part sculpture, part photography without the photograph. And because you had to stay completely still, it was also part endurance test. In wealthier homes, tableaux vivants became elaborate affairs. Costumes were tailored, sets were built, and entire evenings revolved around the performances. Guests would gather, watch a series of living pictures, and then discuss them over tea and cakes. The subjects varied. Famous artworks, Shakespearean scenes, moral allegories. But they all carried the thrill of transformation. Ordinary people stepping into extraordinary roles. For Victorians, who lived in such rigid social boxes, this playful blurring of identities was intoxicating. And soon, photography joined the game. Families staged tableaux specifically for the camera, posing in costume while photographers captured the moment. These became cherished keepsakes, pasted into albums or displayed proudly on mantels. Imagine leafing through a Victorian photo album and seeing your uncle as Julius Caesar, or your mother as a saint, staring solemnly into the lens. The stillness required for early photography suited tableau perfectly. They were already about being motionless. Later, the fun expanded into public exhibitions. Lantern slide shows projected photographs of tableau onto screens for audiences, turning living pictures into communal entertainment. What began in drawing rooms eventually spilled into lecture halls and small theaters. You could pay to watch projected vignettes that blended art, photography, and theater, a direct ancestor of cinema. The Victorians, without realizing it, were laying the groundwork for modern visual storytelling. Now imagine yourself in one of those tableaux. You're dressed in a tunic that was once a tablecloth, holding a papier-mâché sword. Your brother is pretending to faint dramatically at your feet, while your cousin balances a fake crown on her head. The gaslight is hot, the room is stifling, and someone in the audience sneezes. You can't move, not even to scratch your nose. You're trying desperately not to laugh because if you break character, the whole illusion collapses. The absurdity is half the fun. What's striking is how creative this all was. Victorians had few outlets for self-expression compared to us. There were no comic cons, no costume parties, no TikTok filters. But give them a free evening, some bed sheets, and a few willing participants, and they created miniature theaters of their own. They reenacted mythological tales, mocked famous figures, or simply made themselves into art. It was imagination made flesh, however briefly. And yes, there was often a hint of scandal too. Tableaux vivants sometimes veered into the risque. Women in Greek or Roman costumes could be draped in ways that showed more skin than society normally allowed. Because it was art, it was excused up to a point. Critics fretted about the morality of half-dressed maidens posing as goddesses. Audiences, of course, came anyway. The line between refinement and titillation was thin, and Victorians were nothing if not skilled at balancing on it. Seen another way, tableaux were also a quiet rebellion against the monotony of Victorian life. Work was endless, leisure scarce, roles rigid. For a few stolen evenings, you could slip into someone else's identity. You weren't a clerk or a seamstress or a housewife. You were a knight, a queen, a tragic heroine. That transformation, however temporary, carried a kind of liberation. And let's not forget how much children loved it. For them it was pure play, dressing up, performing, being applauded. Many a Victorian child got their first taste of performance not in a theater, but in their parents' parlor, pretending to be Cupid or King Lear. Some would later become actors, writers, or artists, but even for those who didn't, the memory of being part of a tableau lingered. So, as you lie there listening, picture yourself in one of those living rooms. The air is warm, the curtains drawn, the costume slightly ridiculous. You're holding your breath, standing utterly still, while your relatives gaze at you with serious expressions. For a moment, you're not you. You're a figure from myth, frozen in art. And when the scene ends, everyone claps, laughs, and collapses back into themselves, relieved and exhilarated. That was Victorian fun too. Creative, awkward, and surprisingly modern. A glimpse of cosplay before the word existed. A precursor to film before the projector rolled. Proof that even in the stiffest of ages, people longed to play, to transform, to see themselves in new roles. and perhaps that's the best way to understand tableaux vivants. They were neither professional theater nor casual games, but something in between. They were art brought to life, however imperfectly, by ordinary hands. They were family evenings spun into memory. They were, in their own way, both silly and profound. So the next time you hear about a Victorian tableau, don't dismiss it as dull or stuffy. Imagine the laughter, the discomfort, the pride. Imagine how thrilling it was to blur the line between spectator and spectacle, to become the painting rather than just look at it. That was the charm. For a few minutes, you were the art itself. And that, for the Victorians, was fun enough. By now, you've followed Victorians into smoky pubs, noisy circuses, and even candle-lit séances. But not all their fun was loud or public. Some of it was quiet, intimate, and, to modernize, a little eccentric. Imagine evenings by the fire, scissors in hand, collecting scraps of memory and pinning them carefully onto paper. Welcome to the world of scrapbooks, pressed seaweed, and the secret language of flowers. Victorian fun that happened not in the marketplace or the theater, but in the corners of parlors, hidden in plain sight. Scrapbooking was the Instagram of the 19th century, only slower and with more glue. Families kept albums filled with clippings, ticket stubs, drawings, even hair. Yes, sometimes actual locks of hair. Scrapbooks preserved what mattered. Theater programs, visiting cards, sketches, pressed leaves, newspaper cuttings. Imagine yourself leaning over a big leather-bound book, carefully pasting in a clipping from last week's music hall show, or a pressed flower from a seaside picnic. Every page was part diary, part gallery, part social archive, and unlike today's photo dumps, scrapbooks were tangible. You could feel them, smell them, pass them down. They were fun, but they were also legacy, and they weren't just random collections. Many Victorians curated their scrapbooks with painstaking care, arranging images into themes or patterns, almost like collages. Some albums became works of art in their own right, filled with elaborate designs and witty juxtapositions. It wasn't unusual to find political cartoons next to family sketches, or fashion plates pasted beside sentimental poetry. In an age before television, flipping through a scrapbook was entertainment. It was also a way to mark identity, to show what you valued, what you found funny, what you wanted remembered. But scrapbooks weren't the only quiet hobby. Seaweed art, yes, you heard that correctly, was another Victorian craze. Seaweed collecting became especially fashionable after Queen Victoria herself kept an album of pressed specimens. Families visiting the coast would gather fronds, carefully dry them, and then press them onto paper in delicate patterns. The result looked like underwater lace frozen in time. Imagine a scrapbook page where crimson and green strands of seaweed fan out into elaborate floral shapes, each labeled with tiny, meticulous handwriting. For Victorians, this was both art and science. It connected leisure with nature, beauty with study. And if the Queen did it, well, that made it respectable. Think about it. You've just returned from a seaside holiday. Instead of buying a fridge magnet, because of course those don't exist, you unpack a packet of damp seaweed. You lay it out carefully, pressing it flat, arranging the strands into graceful arcs. When it dries, you paste it into your album, sign your name, and feel quietly proud. You've turned the sea itself into art. It's delicate, it's meticulous, and in a strange way, it's soothing. For Victorians, whose daily lives were full of noise and grime, the act of creating something so fragile was almost meditative. And then there was the language of flowers, Today, a bouquet might simply say, "I love you," or "Congratulations." For Victorians, it was practically a code book. Entire dictionaries of floriography, flower meanings, were published. Red roses for passionate love, lilies for purity, violets for modesty, marigolds for grief. Handing someone a bouquet wasn't just polite, it was a carefully constructed message. Imagine receiving a nosegay from an admirer and spending the evening decoding it like a spy. Yellow carnation, disappointment. Ivy, fidelity. Mixed messages, perhaps. Courtship often depended on this floral shorthand. When direct words were taboo, flowers spoke. A suitor too shy or too constrained by etiquette to confess feelings might send a bouquet brimming with symbolism. A young woman might respond with her own arrangement, either encouraging or gently rejecting the advance. Even friendships used flowers as tokens, carrying sentiments of loyalty, remembrance, or sympathy. Parlors and diaries filled with notes on what each bloom meant. Fun wasn't always rowdy. Sometimes it was hidden in the petals of a bouquet, a quiet thrill passed hand to hand. Now, imagine yourself in that world. You're seated in a parlor, scissors snipping, glue pot open, arranging clippings on heavy pages. Beside you lies an album of seaweed specimens, fragile strands pinned neatly in patterns. On the table rests a small bouquet, fragrant and colorful, but heavy with meaning. Perhaps you're arranging a secret message. A sprig of rosemary for remembrance, a daisy for innocence, a pansy for thoughts of love. When your admirer receives it, they will read it like a letter, though never spoken aloud. It's easy to laugh at how seriously Victorians took this, but there's something touching in it too. Their fun wasn't always about escape. It was often about preservation, intimacy, and communication. Scrapbooks preserved memory. Seaweed albums preserved nature. Flowers preserved feelings too delicate to say aloud. Each was a way of making the fleeting permanent, of holding on to something in a world that often felt harsh and short-lived. And notice how often these pastimes belonged to women. While men filled pubs or football fields, women filled albums and arranged bouquets. Scrapbooks became canvases for creativity, even when painting or writing professionally was closed to them. The language of flowers gave women subtle power in courtship. Seaweed art gave them entry into the world of natural science. These hobbies weren't trivial. They were outlets, quiet but meaningful, where women shaped memory and expression in ways society otherwise denied them. So, as you lie there now, picture yourself turning the thick pages of a scrapbook, pausing at a clipping of a faded music hall poster. You trace the pressed seaweed, marvel at how delicate it still looks after decades. You lean over the bouquet in your hand, decoding its silent message. It's leisure, yes, but it's also intimacy. It's creativity without an audience, beauty meant for the drawer, the family, the trusted friend. For Victorians, fun wasn't always about roaring crowds or ghostly knocks in dark parlors. Sometimes it was about scissors, glue, seaweed, and flowers. Strange little treasures that turned the ordinary into something quietly extraordinary. And that too was leisure in the 19th century, coded, delicate, and utterly human. And so we come to the end of our long wander through Victorian fun, or what passed for fun in a world where 12-hour shifts were normal, where soot stained your lungs, and where leisure was rationed like bread. We've seen the contrasts, haven't we? The loud, smoky music halls against the hushed parlors of scrapbooks and flower codes. The rowdy football fields against the polite promenades of spa towns. families crowding piers at the seaside, and others spreading picnics among the tombstones of the dead. Morbid and joyful, ordinary and strange, all existing side by side. If there's one thing the Victorians understood, it was how to squeeze joy out of cramped hours. They didn't have weekends filled with Netflix or shopping malls or theme parks. They had half days on Saturday, and if they were lucky, maybe a few pennies to spare. Yet in that narrow slice of time, they built entire worlds of leisure. Cricket clubs sprang up on muddy fields. Music halls shook with laughter and song. Parlors glowed with children dressed as Greek gods in makeshift costumes. Even the cemetery, grim as it seems, became a playground of sorts. Their fun may look odd to us now. Drinking bitter spa water and calling it medicine. Pressing seaweed into albums like it was treasure. Whispering to ghosts in the dark. But for them, these pastimes weren't just distractions. They were survival. They were tiny rebellions against the grind of labor and loss. They were proof that even in a world offering little rest, people still found ways to play, to laugh, to remember, and to feel alive. So as you drift now, picture those Victorians squeezing fun out of coal smoke and candlelight. Their games, their songs, their rituals, all of it cobbled together out of scraps of time. And remember that leisure has always been less about abundance, more about imagination. If you've stayed with me this long, nearly 3 hours of Victorian amusements, then you've done more than listen. You've kept their stories alive. Subscribing is free for you, but for me, it's a small act of support that makes all the difference. The Victorians fought for leisure. You can fight for memory. Tap subscribe, share a thought in the comments, and know that you've stood alongside me in giving voice to the past. And as you drift off tonight, remember you can take these stories with you ad-free anytime. My first collection, Victorian Madness Volume 1, is available now, complete with a bonus insider story you won't hear on YouTube. Only a handful of copies are released at this time, and the link is waiting in both the description and pinned comment. Sleep well.